Whenever I read a fresh new history book, one of the things that always boggles my mind is how we as a species, humanity, seems to be incapable of actually learning from the past. I know all of our history teachers told us that it's important to study history and to learn from history, and I also know that half of us either ignored them or thought we learned from history when in reality we actually didn't. Because when faced with the same problems that people have historically faced, we seem to all the time fall back into making the same exact errors and mistakes that people in the past made. And of course, this is not something that is unique to the generation that is currently living. It is also something that has always seemed to historically be true, where no matter what happens, even if we have well-documented precedents, we somehow believe that we ourselves are unique. What I'm describing here is a sort of psychological glitch, something that on one hand we might be able to excuse ourselves for, at least to a degree, because this is so common among humanity. Obviously, it's something that is sort of inherent in the way that we look at the world, across cultures and across times. But on the other hand, it is a problem that needs to be overcome because when these mistakes are repeated throughout history, the results are always extremely damaging. And this is the first of two major psychological glitches that I want to discuss today and bring into relation with how we should approach a potential peace plan or diplomacy when it comes to the Russo-Ukrainian war, Russia's war against Ukraine. And the second psychological glitch I want to discuss is this. As humans, we tend to view other humans through the lens of our own thinking and our own human experience. So if we have certain proclivities in a certain direction, we assume that other people think the same way that we do. And this is especially damaging when it comes to trying to stop the efforts of psychopaths. When you look at psychopaths, the kind of people who cause great destructive wars across history, there have always been diplomatic people who assume that these are just reasonable people because they themselves are a reasonable person. They assume that these types of people can be negotiated with. They assume that they can understand the motivations and desires of these types of people, and they mistakenly do not take the actual types of actions that could cause these psychopaths from actually stopping their wars of aggression. And because of that, when we go back to the historical psychological glitch, we see that it almost always takes humanity far longer than necessary to actually take the steps necessary to stop the aggression of a psychopath who has a national army under his control. So to put it succinctly, the first psychological glitch is that we think we're unique. We think our period of history is unique and that the lessons that have played out over thousands of years of human history across many different types of societies somehow don't apply because we're the exception to the rule, just like everybody else throughout history has always thought. And the second psychological glitch is weirdly kind of the opposite, where we look at people who live in our own time and we mistakenly believe that they think the same way that we do. And this is what has caused events to play out throughout history where people do not intervene quickly enough to bring about the desired outcome. And when they realize what is going on, it's already too late, and the mistakes of history repeat themselves. Probably the best example of this is World War II and the lead up to World War II, when Adolf Hitler and the Nazis first started conquering different pieces of Europe. When Adolf Hitler first started attacking different European countries, the media landscape was chillingly similar to the media landscape that we see now today with Russia attacking Ukraine, where a lot of people were saying, you know what, we don't want to provoke a broader war. We see that Hitler is just going after formerly German territories. Maybe he's got a good reason to do that, a good excuse. In either case, it's not our problem. His ambitions are probably limited, So we're going to diplomatically try to solve this by letting him have what he wants. And we're going to keep letting him have what he wants in small increments and small chunks because we believe he could never go any further, because that worst possible scenario is never imaginable to the people who are actually living through it. And so what you see is people sort of going to Hitler diplomatically, saying, we understand your concerns, we understand your grievances, we are not going to intervene to stop you from ruining the lives of other people. The ultimate result, of course, is Hitler is able to capture prime industrial territory. He's able to capture strategically significant territory, and he's allowed to set himself up to pretty quickly and easily ultimately take the entire European continent, only after which those die are already cast that people realize, oh crap, his ambitions are a lot bigger than just restoring what Germany once was. He's gonna push as long as we allow him to push. Maybe now we should actually intervene. And what could have been a relatively short conflict, or at least a comparatively short conflict, ended up blowing up into a massive world war that consumed all of Europe, the United States, most of Asia, and cost 85 million people their lives. All because people looked at Adolf Hitler, a psychopath who wanted to conquer other people through force, and they assumed that he had the same diplomatic instincts that they did, failing to understand the psychology of a person who actually invades other countries and kills innocent people. With these historical precedents in mind, what's extremely important for everybody to understand is that when you look at Russia's invasion of Ukraine in the modern day, it is chillingly similar in so many ways to how Germany got people to go along with their plan to take European territory. There's way more ways it's similar than I can possibly list in this video, but at a high level, what we see is a country invading another country, saying that they are doing so because it is their former territory. It is actually rightfully theirs. Whether or not those people want to be unified with them, it is rightfully their territory. They, at the same time, also push narratives saying that they as a country have been wronged, which of course the people within their own country have a proclivity to believe, and a lot of people in the international community who are looking for a reason to not intervene are also going to have a proclivity to believe. We then see this propaganda machine bumped up to 1,000, where just like in Germany, the German government would lie about literally anything and everything to accomplish their goals. We see the same thing coming out of the Russian government, where it is literally a fire hose of falsehoods. So many falsehoods that you can't even determine what's true. If you can't convince people to be on your side, at least you can paralyze them into inaction. In so many ways, it is the same exact playbook being used for Russia to attack Ukraine and try to get away with it. The problems then that we have faced over the past several years are the same problems that were faced by the people during the period of World War II. And you can read all sorts of history books and watch documentaries and find numerous examples of everything I'm saying here, where people are so not used to somebody who is a psychopath, who is willing to use any person for their own purposes, no matter what or how they use that person, and who is also willing to lie to their face and not even flinch. People are so not used to dealing with that they will find all sorts of reasons to tell themselves that this isn't really happening. This isn't actually true. It couldn't actually be possible that someone this evil is existing in our lifetime and doing such horrible things. Because if that exists, that's a scary reality. Most people don't want to live in scary reality, so they will either justify scary reality or they will just find a reason to ignore scary reality and say that it's not their problem. But the problem with that is When a psychopath is allowed to get away with their psychopathy, they are going to take it to the extent that they are able to take it until they are actually stopped. What you see right now in the United States, though, although maybe the narrative is starting to change with Trump finally getting frustrated with Putin, is people who for years have said we should probably give Vladimir Putin the benefit of the doubt. We should maybe believe some of the Russian propaganda, and we definitely shouldn't intervene. People who have said, well, maybe the reason Russia isn't at peace is just because we have the wrong president in office, and we just need somebody who knows how to talk to Russia to go talk to Russia, and then they'll just end this thing right away because they're such nice people. Not understanding, again, the psychopathy that is actually behind what Russia is doing. Because of this, unsurprisingly, the leadership in the Kremlin in Russia has smelled the weakness of Western leaders the same way that a piranha might smell blood in the water. They know exactly how to take advantage of the situation and how to play and prolong things as long as possible. And now we've seen that this has been allowed to play out even since the US presidential election for a period of over 6 months, where for a while we have been pursuing peace, quote-unquote peace with Russia, and they've acted like they are interested in that while they continue to increase their bombings of Ukrainian cities, where they supposedly agree to ceasefires and then break the ceasefires immediately. And the whole time what you have here is psychopathy in the Kremlin, which very well understands human nature because psychopaths really understand human nature and how to manipulate it, taking advantage of good-hearted people who are not willing to remove the blinders from their eyes and see what kind of a historical period we're really living in. And they are going to continue to take advantage of good-hearted people as long as they possibly can until those good-hearted people realize that the actual way to be good-hearted and to help innocent people is unfortunately to stop these evil people from doing evil things. Something that every society in human history has recognized, which is why every society in human history has had their version of militaries and their version of police forces. This understanding that you need to have a good guy with a weapon sometimes to stop a bad guy with a weapon, because they're not just going to stop when you ask nicely. But for some reason, when it comes to the international level, we pretend like the rules are different, and like basic human psychology changes when you're talking about nation versus nation instead of individual against individual, but it doesn't change. The kind of person who is willing to invade a country, to conquer it, to use its people for its own purposes, is not the kind of person who ever gives up. With that in mind, we can also take a practical look at the war in Ukraine and realize very quickly why diplomacy is actually not the quickest path to peace. So for a moment, just set aside all of the previous discussion about psychology, not because it doesn't apply, but because you can approach each piece of this puzzle on its own merits, and then you can realize the combined force. So let's say you don't buy anything I said about psychology, and you just want to look at the actual nature of the war in Ukraine and find the quickest possible path to peace that costs the least amount of people their lives. That outcome is not diplomacy, not today. Now, the reason I say that is you have to ask yourself a basic question about war whenever you're looking for an end to the war. And that basic question is one that a lot of people who are trying to end the war in Ukraine don't seem to actually be asking, which is what caused this war in the first place, and why hasn't it ended yet? You have to understand that there's an underlying reason for the war, and there's a reason that people are fighting today. And if those reasons are not resolved, any attempt at diplomacy will be short-term at best, and the war will just continue to erupt and erupt and erupt and erupt. And in that circumstance, short-term diplomacy ends to more lives lost in the long term, because during the short term, when people aren't actively fighting each other, they're both going to continue to be building up their military capabilities because they don't trust the other side. They're going to rebuild their capacity, and that means that when they go and duke it out again, the lives lost are going to be higher because, for example, in this case, Russia will have more military equipment that they have been steadily losing that they can now push onto Ukraine all at once, and Ukraine is going to have to defeat all of that to get the war to a similar state where it's at today. So short-term diplomacy, it might be a good political win for whoever happens to be president, whoever happens to be the politician that's negotiating it. But history needs to be measured by long-term outcomes, not just the headlines that a politician generated during their own term. When you look at the war in Ukraine and the underlying reasons and causes that people are still fighting, it's because, and I know this is a big understatement, but just from a logical setup, it's because they have a disagreement that they've determined can't be resolved by any means other than fighting. They have such a severe disagreement, again, I know it's understating things, that they have decided to send soldiers to actively attack each other to try to force the other side to their position. Now, with that in mind, that activity is not going to end until one side loses sufficient capacity to feel like they are no longer capable of forcing the other side to their position. So if we want a quick end to the war, especially when we consider the psychological components I've already mentioned, what we need to ask is, what is the fastest path to forcing one other side to the other side's position? And unfortunately, and to its shame, the United States has at first approached the end to the war in Ukraine as if the fastest path was by forcing Ukraine to accept Russia's position, trying to convince Ukraine that they could never achieve their objectives, that they did not have the cards, that they could never push Russia out of their territory. That is the approach the United States initially took, assuming that basically it was a shorter path for Ukraine to lose than it was for Russia. But in reality, when we look at what's going on and the actual goals of either side, it's the opposite, and the United States completely got this wrong. For one, when you understand the motivations of what caused Russia to invade Ukraine in the first place, it's very clear that an end to the conflict in Ukraine, an end to the conflict in Ukraine, wouldn't actually be the end of the conflict. Because, again, as we've seen from history, when you reward a psychopath who invades a country and you allow them to get what they want, their psychology doesn't change. In fact, now they feel very successful and empowered, and they want to go do what they just did again, even if they need a short period of time to regroup and rebuild. So just on its surface, assuming that Ukraine being defeated means an end to the war is just silly and foolish. Even more than that, even if you completely discount the psychological components and you say Russia will never be willing to invade another country, you still see that having Ukraine lose the war is not the shortest path to an end to the war, for a couple of different reasons. First of all, you have to look at the competing objectives of either side, and just from a territorial standpoint, which one of those is easier to achieve. We know that Russia's objective, at least when they first invaded Ukraine in their full-scale invasion, was to topple the Ukrainian government at the very least. And with that, the implicit goal is either to directly control Ukraine's territory themselves and make it all a part of Russia, or to set up a puppet government that serves Russia's interests and basically have Ukraine's territory be de facto a part of Russia. This is in fact what Russia attempted to do, and arguably what they're still attempting to do, and why they haven't backed off their war against Ukraine yet, even though they've been held at bay for so long. And a lot of analysts have looked at what it would actually cost Russia to achieve these objectives, and the numbers are staggering. When you look at the loss rates of how many men Russia has to spend to gain territory in Ukraine today, when you extrapolate that to the entire country, to take over all of Ukraine, Russia would need to lose something in the neighborhood of tens of millions, to some estimates say over 100 million soldiers, and understand their population is only 140 million people. This would be a process that would have to play out over decades using Russia's current strategies and rates of gains. And even while those things could change, it is still very clear that the cost for Russia to take Ukrainian territory to the point that they have tried previously would be astronomical. just looking at the map, it's very clear that it is an easier objective for Ukraine to achieve all that they want, which is simply to kick the Russian soldiers off Ukrainian territory where they don't belong in the first place. When you just look at the map, the portion of territory that Ukraine wants to control is much smaller than the portion of territory that Russia would still need to conquer. Obviously, this would be a very costly objective for Ukraine to achieve. However, it is not impossible, and the casualties again are far less than Russia. Ukraine's current strategy of not really pushing for that, but rather engaging in a war of attrition with Russia, is a modified version of this strategy that is even less costly. Ukraine will continue to hold their lines and exert as many casualties as they need to on Russia until Russia's front line collapses, either militarily or more likely economically. And once that happens, then Ukraine can more easily achieve their objective of taking their territory back without losing nearly as many men. They are playing the long game to save more lives. So again, even from this standpoint, we see diplomacy just leads to more wars in the future, whereas supporting Ukraine, while results in more war right now in this moment, from multiple different angles, results in the least loss of life overall. And that's not just Ukrainian life, it's also Russian life, and it's also the lives of any other countries that Russia might ever get an idea to invade. Whatever approach we take, it is very clear that that approach cannot be based on ignorance or wishful thinking. The stakes are just too high, there are far too many people's lives on the line. And it would be ignorant to assume that Vladimir Putin is just going to wake up tomorrow and change his mind on the whole invasion thing. That limits our options for what is actually a reasonable path forward for Ukraine. And unfortunately, all of the remaining options are not easy options. And I think that is why politicians have had such a hard time embracing and pursuing them. Because nobody wants to make the hard decisions that are actually necessary. Everybody wants to pass those decisions on to the next guy. And unfortunately, history tells us exactly where that leads in the long term. Now, if you want more in-depth analysis of this war with more facts and figures and covering individual aspects like Russia's economy or Russia's military performance, I'm going to put a couple videos on screen that I think you'll especially enjoy if you liked this one. So I encourage you to watch those. Before you go, though, I just want to say a quick thank you to all of the patrons and all the people who buy me coffees and all the people who leave super thanks here on YouTube. I am largely supported by my community, and I really appreciate all of you who have done so far. If you would like to support my channel, you can get involved in that as well. It's completely voluntary, nothing's behind a paywall, just a way for people who want to support the channel to do so. And you can learn more about that by scanning the QR code on screen or by following the link in the description of this video. Thanks so much for watching, guys. Let me know your thoughts in the comments, whether you agree or disagree and why, and I'll see you on the next one.